Maria or Clara? Or Elizabeth?
It's Christmas. Someone new, Billy.
Like in Russia.
When the bus is turned around. They sound like you.
Hey everyone, tonight we open a dossier on a Black Ledger page that shouldn't exist, yet somehow predicts a City Hall vote before the public ever hears the word contract. You probably won't want to believe. If this case hooks you, hit like and subscribe so you can follow the file as it gets darker. Keep the lights low. You sit at a desk that looks temporary, assembled for the sole purpose of keeping secrets organized. A single lamp hums. Rain ticks the window. The room smells like toner, damp paper, and old glue. In the center of your desk is the evidence object, a clear plastic evidence bag, thin and crinkled, the kind that clings to your fingertips when the air is wet. The seal strip has been peeled and pressed back down at an angle. Inside it rests one torn sheet from a bound ledger. The page is heavier than normal paper, almost stiff. 3 staple holes run down one edge, stretched into little ovals where the page was yanked free. One corner is water darkened and curled. The surface is rough with dried coffee rings, and the ink has bled in places where moisture once sat, patient and quiet. I log the chain of custody tag before I touch the seal, because the first defense a system has is to argue you handled it wrong. Now you tilt the bag under the lamp and read the page the way you read a person. Not for what it says out loud, but for what it can't stop revealing. There are columns of figures, short codes, tight handwriting that never relaxes into full names. Some entries are ballpoint, pressed hard, angry little grooves in the fiber. Others are pencil, faint and smudged, as if the writer changed their mind mid-number and tried to erase the thought. Along the margin, fingerprints appear as dull, oily crescents. Somebody held this page close. Bow at the top in block letters, a label that sounds like a dare, Black Ledger, and beneath it, a date that turns the night colder. Because the official story says this ledger is a hoax. City Hall's statement, repeated by calm voices on bright mornings, claims the page surfaced after the fact, dumped by a disgruntled employee, full of inaccurate figures and misleading annotations. They call the irregularities administrative errors. They insist procurement is transparent. They say the page appeared in October, but the date printed on your desk on this torn sheet is June. June, the month before the vote, before the press conference, before anyone outside a small circle knew there was money worth chasing. A torn page is never just a page. It's evidence of a missing book. You flip the bag, and on the back you see faint ink bleed through, a ghost of entries from sheets that are no longer here. The absence is loud. Someone decided you didn't get the full ledger, only enough to start a fight. So you resist the easy thrill. You don't treat this as a confession. Paper is obedient. Paper tells the story the hand wanted it to tell. Sometimes the hand belongs to someone trying to expose a fix. Sometimes it belongs to someone trying to plant one. You look for the parts that don't care about narrative, the codes, in the margin, beside one line of figures. 2 words sit like a procedural shrug. PO split, purchase order split. Harmless in training manuals, dangerous in practice. Here's the mechanism, and it's colder than any villain speech. Municipal buying runs on thresholds. Under a certain dollar amount, a department can purchase with minimal review. Under another, it can collect a few quotes and call it competitive over the higher line. The system forces sunlight, public bids, posted agendas, committee review, a vote that leaves fingerprints. Those thresholds are supposed to protect the public, but the thresholds are made of paperwork, and paperwork folds. You take a $90,000 job that should trigger a bid, and you slice it into smaller pieces that slide under the limit. 9 invoices, different cost centers, dates staggered like footsteps, line items renamed until they sound like routine maintenance, emergency repair, site stabilization, temporary services. Each one looks ordinary alone. Together, they are a river. Following that river is the money trail, and the system counts on you giving up before you reach the mouth. The ledger doesn't write the word bribe. It doesn't need to. It records motion, rounded totals, repeated vendor codes, notes like rush that create urgency on paper, so nobody stops to ask why the work couldn't he wait. Rush is how you replace scrutiny with exhaustion. I trace one recurring code to a public vendor registry and note carefully that the listed address doesn't match the scale of the payments implied here. That's all you can claim right now. In a real dossier, you don't accuse without proof, and proof is a pile of documents that refuses to be swept away. But you can already feel the case leaning toward you, because this isn't just about money. It's about timing. It's about how the system protects itself when the numbers get loud. A city hall fix rarely happens in a smoky back room anymore. It happens in daylight, wearing procedures like gloves. It happens when a department head knows which procurement officer is overloaded, which clerk is new enough to follow directions, which agenda packet will be posted late on a Friday, and which committee meeting will be scheduled when the room is empty. The ledger page isn't a confession. It's a schedule disguised as accounting. And June means someone was tracking the schedule before the city wrote its public story. Turn the bag again. And that S, when you catch the detail that makes the press release feel less like spin and more like a deliberate alibi. Near the bottom of the sheet, faint as a bruise under skin, there's an impression of a circular stamp, official, bureaucratic. The ink isn't fully visible, but the curve of a word is there. RECEI, received. If this page was received inside the building in June, then October isn't the origin. October is a chosen date, a safer date, a date that makes the page look like revenge instead of record keeping. Now your questions sharpen. Who received it? Where it was logged? Why it was torn out instead of copied? Why the city's statement insists on October when the paper insists on June? A cold case doesn't stay cold because no one cared. It stays cold because someone cared enough to freeze it, to lock the story in a safe timeline and call it settled. Tonight, You've just put your hand on the ice, and the ice remembers. You don't start the next night with a new mystery. You start it with the city's voice. The evidence object sits on your desk like it was designed to be handled, passed around, believed. A City Hall press release, printed on thick, bright paper that feels too clean for what it's trying to bury. The ink is crisp. The letterhead is embossed so lightly you only feel it when you drag a fingernail across the top edge. There's a faint chemical scent, fresh toner and hot rollers. The smell of an office that never sleeps because it can't afford to. It arrives folded in thirds, the way official truth likes to travel. There's a staple in the corner, one leg slightly bent, as if someone removed and replaced it in a hurry. Along the bottom margin, a line of tiny print about forward-looking statements and ongoing review. The kind of language that pretends humility while building a fence. You smooth it flat, and the rain outside sounds like static, like the world trying to tune in. The statement is simple. That's the first tell. It says the ledger page is inaccurate. It says the city welcomes oversight. It says procurement is robust. It says any irregularities were the result of clerical errors that have since been corrected. It names no names. It describes no mechanism. It's an umbrella held perfectly over the people who matter. You read it once, then again, but the second time you read it like a detective reads a confession from someone trained not to confess. You listen for what isn't there. No invoice numbers, no purchase orders, no vendor names, no project code, no dates beyond a vague recent weeks, no acknowledgements that a torn ledger page can appear out of nowhere unless a full book existed somewhere first. The city gives you a story, not a timeline. And the gap between story and timeline is where the case starts to breathe. You pull the ledger page from its evidence bag again and lay it beside the press release. One is messy, human, impatient. The other is polished, committee approved, sterilized. You don't need to believe either. You need to test them. Pick one figure from the ledger, a rounded number with a note beside it that looks like a shrug. You follow it outward into public records, vendor payment listings, council agenda attachments, the procurement dashboard nobody advertises, but everyone points to when they're cornered. The money trail doesn't run like a straight line. It runs like plumbing. It disappears into walls, reroutes behind panels, then reappears as a summary that looks final but isn't. Here's the first place the system hides, in aggregation. Public-facing procurement reports are built to soothe. They show totals by department, totals by quarter, totals by vendor category, all clean and unthreatening. They rarely show the guts, the line item descriptions, the cost centers, the dates invoices were approved, the names of the people who clicked OK when the numbers didn't add up. When those details are missing, corruption doesn't have to be clever. It only has to be procedural. You notice something small, and once you see it, you can't unsee it. A spreadsheet attachment to a council agenda. A contract award summary. It has columns for vendor, amount, and recommended action. But the column headers stop short of the information you'd need to check anything. There's no scope, no bid method, no threshold justification, no emergency declaration, ID. it spit a table designed to look like transparency without being it. You compare the totals to the ledger page. They don't match. Not in a dramatic way, in a careful way, in a way that suggests someone engineered the mismatch to be explainable. The press release offers you a pre-packaged explanation. Clerical error. Clerical error is the system's favorite phrase because it blames the lowest rung without threatening the ladder. It suggests the problem is handwriting, not intent. It suggests the fix is training, not accountability. But clerical errors don't repeat in patterns. Patterns have incentives, and the incentives live in forms. A city's procurement process is a maze of approvals, and every approval is a chance to move blame downhill. Department requests, purchasing review, legal check, budget verification, committee agenda, council vote, invoice processing, payment release, audit sampling. Each step has a person. Each person has too much work. Each person is told, quietly, that stopping the flow makes them difficult. So the system learns a trick. It doesn't break rules. It rearranges them. Split the purchase order. Label the work as urgent. Root it under a blanket contract that already exists. Use a change order to expand a scope after the vote. When questions come, hand the public a summary that omits the columns where the trick lives. And if someone requests the full detail, that's where redacted becomes a verb. You file the request anyway. You ask for the invoices, the purchase orders, the approvals, the email chains that decide what gets called urgent. You ask for the internal log that would show when a document was received. I submit the request and write down the exact language I used, because later the argument won't be about truth. It'll be about wording. Days pass like dripping water. Then the city responds. And the response is a lesson in how to deny without saying no. Some documents are unavailable. Some are non-responsive. Some are provided as PDFs that can't be searched, scanned as images, the numbers visible but trapped, and the ones that could connect the ledger to an official action are clipped, boxed, and blacked out. Entire paragraphs turned into midnight. Not everything is redacted for corruption. Sometimes it's privacy. Sometimes it's security. Sometimes it's legal caution. In a real dossier, you have to admit uncertainty, but you also have to notice when the black ink falls in the same places every time. Names, approval notes, justifications, the columns that would explain why the totals are what they are. You lay the press release on top of the agenda summary and slide it until the edges align. The city's story sits perfectly over the missing data, like it was tailored to fit. You find a footnote in the agenda attachment, tiny, almost apologetic. It says amounts may reflect adjustments. Adjustments is another umbrella word. Adjustments is what you call a change that you don't want to narrate. You go back to the ledger page, to the penciled entries, the smudged numbers, the codes that refuse to be names. You look for a second point of contact, something public enough to verify. A project title, maybe a budget line, an address. There it is, a partial reference, written like shorthand. Civic Annex, a building name that doesn't belong to the city's official narrative. The press release never mentions it. The agenda summary lists only facilities improvements. Vague, soft, the kind of phrasing that keeps citizens from picturing a specific door. But you picture it anyway. And once you have a place, the case stops feeling abstract. It becomes physical. It becomes a door that somebody paid to open quietly. You check the council calendar. You check meeting minutes. You check the agenda packet dates. You build a timeline out of public postings. And the postings don't line up the way the city's voice wants them to. The ledger's June date keeps returning like a pulse. If the city is right, the ledger is a later fabrication, built from information that was already public. That's one plausible interpretation. If the ledger is right, it means someone inside the machine knew the outcome early, logged the spending in advance, and later tried to control when the paper surfaced. That's another plausible interpretation. There's a third. The ledger is partially true, partially staged. A weapon planted by one faction inside City Hall to wound another. Systems don't only hide corruption. They generate rivalries. They turn information into leverage. You don't get to pick the most dramatic option. You get to pick the one the evidence can support. And right now, the evidence supports one thing with stubborn consistency. The official story is built to survive questions, not answer them. You sit with that realization until it feels heavier than the paper, and you feel the case turning from scandal into structure, from a single bad act into a familiar pattern, a bureaucracy that can explain anything as an error, as long as the public never sees the columns where intent hides. The press release tries to close the file. It uses calm language, and it asks you, politely, to move on. But you've already learned what it doesn't want you to learn. A system doesn't fear accusations. It fears a clean, documented sequence of approvals. It fears a timeline that refuses to be folded into thirds. The packet arrives the way bad news likes to arrive. Heavy, official, and pretending to be helpful. Your desk lamp throws a pale cone across the evidence object, and the object looks like it's been built to discourage the human spirit. A thick FOIA response packet, bound in a cheap plastic spine that squeaks when you flex it. The cover page is bright white and slightly glossy, the kind of paper that catches fingerprints like it's keeping score. A return address label sits in the corner with machine-printed calm. The envelope glue still smells faintly sour, like something sealed in a hurry and left to sweat. You lift the spine. It has weight, not just of paper, but of intention. The pages inside are uneven, some cut clean, some torn as if ripped from larger packets. The corners are dog-eared from being handled by someone who didn't want to be seen handling them. A few sheets carry the ghost of staples long removed. When you fan the stack, the air gives off that dry, papery odor that means time and filing cabinets and rooms without windows. I log the receipt time and the package condition before I turn to the first page. Because the first argument you'll face is never you're wrong. It's you can't prove your process. The city's response letter sits on top, polite and weaponized. It thanks you for your interest. It confirms the request. It explains, in smooth language, that certain information is withheld under applicable exemptions. It offers you an appeal path that reads like a maze designed by someone paid per dead end. You flip to the first attachment. The black bars hit you like a door slamming. Whole paragraphs are swallowed. Entire names vanish under thick ink. Numbers disappear in the exact places where numbers would connect. The document doesn't look confidential. It looks erased. And the erasure is so consistent, it becomes its own kind of handwriting. This is what redacted really means in practice. Not we protected privacy, but we controlled sequence. You expected that. You didn't expect how surgical it would be. The packet includes invoices, but the line items are blocked. It includes emails, but the body text is gone, leaving only timestamps like bones. It includes approvals, but not the notes that justify them. You get headers without context, signatures without names, and a pile of pages that insist a story exists while refusing to tell it. You don't panic. You build a timeline anyway. You lay the documents across your desk like a map of a city drawn from memory, overlapping, imperfect, but still navigable if you trust patterns more than promises. Date stamps here, email times there. I received notation on one page, a processed notation on another. You connect them with the tip of your finger, not because your finger has power, but because your brain needs the path to be physical. And then you find the first crack in the blackout. On a printed email chain, the body is gone. A long rectangle of nothing, but the routing line survives. A tiny line that says, who forwarded it to whom. The city forgot that headers are stubborn. From purchasing compliance to Office of the City Attorney CC, Accounts Payable Supervisor, it's not a smoking gun. It's a direction sign. Your pulse doesn't spike. It steadies. Because this is what systems do when they're rerunning a fix. They don't just move money. They move risk. They route questions to the department trained to turn questions into paperwork. That's the system insight hiding under the black ink. When a city wants to protect itself, it doesn't only redact documents. It centralizes interpretation. It pushes everything through legal review, not because every detail is sensitive, but because legal language can be used like fog. Non-responsive, deliberative process. Attorney-client privilege. Words that sound like rules and function like locks. Foyer isn't a single door. It's a hallway with side doors labeled fees, extensions, clarifications, overly broad, no records. Each door is a delay mechanism. Each delay cools outrage into fatigue. And once fatigue arrives, the money trail gets to keep moving while you stand in line for paper that arrives already wounded. You keep turning pages. A procurement form appears, mostly blanked out, but not all of it. The project identifier is missing. The vendor is missing. But the category survives. Emergency work authorization. The date survives too. June 9th. Your stomach tightens, not with drama, with arithmetic. June 9th is before the vote, before the public agenda packet, before the city's chosen month of October. It sits inside your timeline like a nail. So either the city is lying about the origin, or the city is telling the truth in a way only lawyers can love. The ledger page surfaced in October, yes, but the work it describes started earlier, and someone inside knew it needed an emergency label to keep the approvals quiet. You can't claim which yet, not honestly, but you can feel the mechanism. Emergency authorizations are supposed to be rare. Floods, fires, structural hazards. A broken pipe that can't wait for committee schedules. The idea is speed over perfection, because people need functioning services more than perfect process. But once you learn how to declare an emergency on paper, you learn how to buy silence with it. Emergency work lets a department bypass competitive bidding. It justifies direct awards. It shortens review. And if anyone asks later, the system points to a form and says, "We followed procedure." Procedure is the city's favorite alibi. It's how you wash intent in a sink full of stamps. You find an authorization justification memo. The title is visible. The entire body is redacted. That's not privacy. That's the heart of the case. Because the justification memo is where someone explains, in plain language, why rules were bent. Put it where the system either admits urgency or invents it. It's where you would learn who made the call. Instead, you get a black rectangle. You slide that page closer and notice something the ink can't hide. Indentation. The imprint of a pen pressed hard as someone signed below the redaction line. There's pressure in the paper. Anger, maybe. Fear, maybe. Or just a person trying to finish a task before their conscience caught up. I run a gloved thumb along the lower margin, feeling the grooves where the signature should be, and I note the page number as if page numbers can substitute for names. They can't, but they can lead you. You keep going. Invoices show approved stamps, but not the approver. Emails show FYI subject lines, but not content. A vendor list appears with addresses blacked out, but one address slips through in a footer, a formatting mistake. A street number and a zip code that match the one address pattern you were circling earlier. The shadow isn't a silhouette on a wall. It's a formatting error in a document someone thought nobody would read closely. You circle the surviving digits. You don't celebrate. You don't even smile. You just feel the case becoming real enough to scare the people who prefer it stay theoretical. Then you reach the last item, and it hits different. A single page, thin and slightly gray, like it came from a fax machine that's been suffering for years. It's a routing slip, old school, the kind of document that exists because someone wanted a paper trail for the paper trail. Most of it is redacted, of course, but there's a stamp, clean and undeniable, received city clerk intake, June the 12th of June 12th. The same date you've been living in. The date the ledger page claimed without asking for permission. And that S when you understand why this feels like a cold case, even though it S, still warm with recent ink. Because the system isn't only fighting about whether wrongdoing happened. It's fighting about where the story begins. If the story begins in October, it's a leak, a scandal, a personnel issue, something to manage. If the story begins in June, it's premeditation, it's planning. It means the machine knew the vote outcome early enough to log it, and the paperwork was arranged to make that knowledge look ordinary. You stare at the stamp until the letters blur. and you realize the stamp isn't proof of guilt. It's proof of access. Someone inside City Clerk Intake touched this. Someone logged it. Someone routed it. Someone had a chance to copy it, bury it, or weaponize it. And now you have a new kind of question, sharper than did they do it. Whom decided what the public is allowed to know and when? The rain keeps tapping your window, steady as a metronome. The packet sits open like a mouth that refuses to speak. But it already told you enough. The redactions aren't random. They're a pattern of protection, and the pattern points upward. You walk into the clerk's office the way you walk into a church after closing, not to pray, to listen for what still echoes. The building is awake in the ugliest way. Fluorescent hum, stale air, carpet that smells faintly of old raincoats and hot electronics. Behind the public counter, the world is arranged into trays and labels and policies that pretend time is something you can file. Tonight, time is the thing that refuses to stay filed. Your evidence object is on the desk before you even sit down with it. A single photocopied intake log sheet, thin paper with a grey cast, as if it was born tired. The top margin is clipped at a crooked angle, like someone fed it into a scanner too fast. Along the left edge, 3 punched holes are frayed, the paper fuzzing outward as if it's been handled too many times. There's a faint smell of overheated plastic from the copier. Across the page, rows, dates, item type, received by routing. It's the kind of object nobody notices until it becomes the only thing that matters. And in the middle, a line that aligns with the stamp you already found. June 12th. Intake. A category that reads like it could be anything. MISC. Documents. The received by field is not blacked out. Not fully. It's there, but it's been partially redacted. A thick marker swipe that leaves the first letter visible, then eats the rest. A single initial survives. That's what you get. Not a name, not a face. One letter that feels like a dare. You don't treat it like a culprit. You treat it like a coordinate. Because in a real dossier, you don't get villains. You get processes. You get people shaped by processes. You get shadows where accountability should be. You request a brief interview through the formal channel because the formal channel is part of the story. If you go unofficial, the system gets to call you sloppy. If you go official, the system gets to run you through its own timeline until your questions arrive late and exhausted. The clerk you meet is careful the way someone becomes careful after years of being blamed for things they didn't design. They keep their voice even. They keep their hands busy. They do not volunteer extra nouns. You introduce the page without calling it an accusation. You call it a record. You ask, softly, how intake works when something arrives that doesn't fit a form. The answer comes out rehearsed, but not evil. Everything gets logged. Everything gets routed. We don't decide what matters. That line is the system speaking through a human throat. Here, the system inside the desk wants you to learn. Intake is built as a shock absorber. Clerks are trained to process, not interpret. If something explosive arrives, it is immediately transformed into neutral categories. MISC, documents, Shanedo correspondence, public inquiry, labels that remove heat. That heat then becomes someone else's problem, rooted upward to legal, to compliance, to the office that knows which words can shrink a scandal into a clerical issue. It's not conspiracy, it's architecture, and architecture can be used. You ask about June 12th. The clerk hesitates, not dramatically, but in the small way people hesitate when they read deciding whether a memory is safe to share. Then they tell you the official story again, the one that keeps the building clean. October, they say, like a date can wash a stamp. You don't argue. You place the log sheet between you, flat and quiet. You let the paper do what paper does best. You point to the line item. June 12th, the partial initial, the routing box. The clerk looks down, then up, then down again. Their eyes narrow the way eyes narrow when a person realizes not being asked to remember. They're being asked to reconcile. They offer a correction, then a retreat. Sometimes the system auto-fills dates, they say. Sometimes a copy gets logged later, and the original is elsewhere. That's possible. You say nothing. You let the possibility hang. Because with the sender and project title mostly redacted, you cannot prove what missed documents actually was. You can't claim certainty. What you can do is lay out plausible interpretations and see which one the room tries hardest to kill. Interpretation 1. The log entry is a true intake record. The ledger page, or something tied to it, arrived June 12th, got stamped, got routed, and later the public narrative moved the origin to October. Interpretation 2. The log entry reflects a backdated administrative step. A document surfaced later, but someone, or some workflow, anchored it to June, because that's when the underlying procurement action began. And the intake system is echoing internal reality rather than public messaging. Interpretation 3. This line was created or modified to generate confusion, either to discredit the ledger by muddying the timeline, or to protect someone by making the record look unreliable. You don't tell the clerk which one you believe. You ask one question instead. How many hands touch a document between intake and the city attorney? The clerk exhales, almost a laugh, but it isn't funny. It's fatigue. More than it should, they say. Then comes the part they don't want to say outright. They gesture toward the trays, the scanners, the binders of procedures. Their language stays clean, but the meaning is grim. If something looks sensitive, it gets rooted upward fast. If something looks politically sensitive, it gets rooted upward faster. And once it hits legal review, it becomes less a document and more a liability object. It stops being information and becomes risk. Risk is managed. Managed means controlled distribution, controlled wording, controlled release dates, controlled redactions. And redacted does not always mean hidden from you. It can mean reshaped for you. You ask about the initial, the one surviving letter on the log sheet. The clerk's eyes flick away, then back. They say they can't confirm personnel details. That's true, and it's also convenient. The system protects itself by forbidding the sharing of the one thing that would connect paper to a person. I note their refusal exactly as stated. Because refusals are also evidence when they repeat in the same shape. You press gently, not for a name, but for a workflow. Who stamps received? You ask. A person or a machine? The clerk answers without thinking. A person, always a person. That matters. Because if the stamp is human, then the stamp has context. The stamp belongs to someone who saw the item long enough to decide it required formal intake. And now you feel the case shifting. The ledger is no longer only a page of numbers. It's a story about how a system can take a dangerous object and turn it into a harmless category before it ever reaches sunlight. You look again at the photocopy. The ink is faint in spots, heavier in others. In the routing field, a notation survives, barely, like a pencil mark that didn't get erased, only smeared. Council, not a department code, not a mailbox number. A word, council, a direction toward the office that knows how to turn a scandal into a press release. And that's when the clerk's memory changes again. They start speaking in maybes. Could have been, they say. Might have been. I don't recall. This isn't proof of deception. Memory is porous. Workdays blur. Intake is repetitive. If you touch 200 documents, no single one wants to be remembered. But the pattern is still telling. They are confident about policy. They are vague about exceptions. They are clear about October. They are foggy about June. And the more you align your questions to the timeline, the more the answers lean away from it. You gather your papers. You thank them. You leave without a confrontation, because confrontations make people defensive, and defensive people stop making mistakes. Outside, the rain hits your face like a reset button. You don't feel satisfied. You feel narrowed, focused. The ledger page now has a human choke point, a desk, a stamp, a hand, a partial initial, a routing note that points toward legal control. The shadow isn't a monster. It's a workflow. And if you want the truth, you don't hunt a person first. You hunt the inbox that turns documents into silence. You don't chase corruption by staring at the loudest number. You chase it by looking for repetition where there shouldn't be any. The evidence object on your desk is a paper-clipped stack of vendor registration printouts, corporate registry pages, and a thin W9 received cover sheet that smells faintly of burnt coffee and old staples. The top page is creased down the center like it lived in a pocket too long. The ink is slightly faded at the edges, the way cheap printers age. Someone has circled a line with a red pen so hard the paper dents under it. The circled line isn't a name. It's an address, not the full address. Not something you can drive to, not something you can publish, not something you'd ever want to, even if you could. Just enough to see the pattern. The same suite number, the same mailbox designator, the same sterile formatting, appearing again and again under different company names, like a chorus, wearing different masks. You anchor the pages under your lamp and start reading them the way you read a room full of people pretending not to know each other. Different vendors, different LLCs, different doing business as names. But the paperwork keeps humming the same note. A shared registered agent, a shared phone prefix, a shared principal place of business, that looks more like a mail drop than an office where work is done. That S, when the money trail stops feeling like a single line and starts feeling like a braid. City Hall's public documents don't always show you vendor ownership. They don't always show you subcontractors. They don't always show you who's behind a vendor number. On the surface, it looks like competition. 5 bids, 5 winners, 5 separate companies, a healthy market. But when you peel back the administrative skin, you start to see how a market can be staged without ever forging a signature. Here's the system's favorite trick: fragmentation. A city can tell you it hired vendor A for site stabilization, vendor B for consulting, vendor C for materials, vendor D for security, and vendor E for temporary services. 5 purchase orders, 5 invoices, 5 invoices, 5 vendors. On paper, it's diversity. In practice, it can be one shop splitting itself into 5 faces so it can win 5 times without looking like it's winning 5 times. This is how you hide control without breaking rules. You, Dante, need a backroom bribe when the system rewards you for knowing which boxes to check. Vendor registration forms are supposed to prevent this. They ask for ownership details. They ask for tax identifiers. They ask for conflict disclosures. They ask, politely, whether you are related to anyone in government. But those forms are only as strong as enforcement. And enforcement is where incentives rot. Procurement officers are built to move. They're measured on throughput, on compliance checklists, on whether the file is complete, not whether the file is honest. If the paperwork looks right and the deadlines are loud, the system becomes a factory that stamps approval, rather than a skeptic that asks why the same sweet number keeps returning in different suits. You hold the stack and feel the paper edges bite your fingertips, dry and sharp. A few pages have been photocopied so many times the letters look like ghosts. And there, in the footer of one printout, a line that should have been routine but now reads like a confession. Registered agent. Redacted that word again. Redacted. Not always sinister, but always useful to the people who benefit from distance. If the public can't easily see who owns what, then accountability becomes a hobby for the sleepless. It becomes something only you do at 2 a.m. under a lamp with coffee gone cold. I cross-check the vendor numbers against the City's vendor portal and note that 2 of the separate companies were approved within days of each other, processed by the same internal reviewer. That alone proves nothing. It proves proximity, not intent. But proximity is how systems leave fingerprints without touching the glass. You keep digging, and the pattern deepens. One vendor has no web presence beyond a generic landing page. Another has a phone line that always routes to voicemail. A third lists construction services, but its filings show no employees. A fourth claims a specialty that doesn't match the invoices you can see. The fifth has a name that sounds like a legacy firm, but the incorporation date is recent enough to still smell like fresh paper. If this is innocent, there are plausible explanations. Maybe the address is a shared office building with many tenants, and your brain is overfitting a pattern because you want one. Maybe the registered agent is a common service used by legitimate businesses. Maybe the City S vendor portal collapses data in ways that make different entities look related when they aren't. Or maybe the shadow you've been circling is exactly what it looks like. A cluster of entities designed to win contracts while appearing unrelated, built to survive surface-level checks. There's another plausible interpretation, too. One that feels uglier because it's more human. Maybe somebody inside City Hall didn't build the shell network to steal. Maybe they built it to control, to ensure favored vendors got work, to keep projects on schedule, to avoid the messy unpredictability of real competition. A fix doesn't always start as greed. Sometimes it starts as impatience, as a belief that the rules are too slow for real-world needs. And then the paperwork becomes habit. The habit becomes culture. The culture becomes a machine. You look at the circled suite number again, and you realize why it keeps showing up. Because addresses are the quietest identifiers in bureaucratic life. Names change. Companies dissolve. Phone numbers rotate. But an address, especially a mail drop address, stays stable. It's the anchor point for entities that need to be born and die without leaving a trail anyone can easily follow. That's why the ledger mattered. It wasn't just numbers. It was a hint that someone inside the building tracked these flows with confidence, as if the outcome was known, as if the competition was choreography. The cold case feeling returns, even though this isn't history, because now you can sense the same old tactic. Overwhelm the public with complexity. Make the story so procedural, so dry, that only insomniacs keep reading. You stack the printouts again, straightening corners, aligning edges. It feels like trying to align truths that don't want to meet. And in the bottom of the pile, beneath the corporate registry pages, you find the smallest piece of paper, the one that hits you hardest. A vendor portal login reset printout, accidentally included. A system-generated page with most details removed, but one timestamp still visible. The reset request is triggered late at night, right before a new vendor profile is approved. Not proof of wrongdoing, but proof of activity. Proof that someone, somewhere, is touching the machinery after hours. You sit back and listen to the rain. The city doesn't need to threaten you. It just needs to keep its files complicated enough that you stop asking. But you don't stop. Because once you see 5 vendors breathing from the same address, you can't pretend it's just clerical error. You can't pretend it's just bad optics. You have to consider that the system is doing what it was trained to do. Reward the people who know how to navigate forms, and punish the people who ask what the forms are hiding. And now the case isn't only about who took what. It's about who built the maze. You expect the missing record to be missing in a normal way. Misfiled, delayed, still being processed. You expect incompetence, because incompetence is comforting. It doesn't require a villain. It only requires time. But tonight the absence feels engineered. The evidence object is a single-page internal memo, photocopied twice and handled too much. The paper is thin, almost translucent under the lamp, with a soft grit to it like it absorbed dust from a filing cabinet for months. The top edge is torn, as if someone ripped it from a pad in a hurry. There's a staple shadow in the corner, the ghost of a second page that should be attached, but isn't, across the top. A stamp sits slightly crooked, purple ink bleeding into the fibers. Confidential case scope below that, a header line that makes your throat tighten. Not from fear, from math. Ledger response, review, scope, and communications plan. And then the date. June 10th. Not October. Not after the leak. Not after the public outrage. Before. Before the meeting called to address concerns. Before the City Hall fix becomes a headline. Before the story, as the city wants it told, is even allowed to begin. You don't treat it as a smoking gun. You treat it as a fork in your timeline, because there are plausible explanations that don't involve wrongdoing. A response review could be a routine contingency document, drafted early because rumors were already circulating. The date could reflect a template reused from another matter. The memo could be misstated, misfiled, or incomplete. But the paper in your hands doesn't feel like a template. It feels specific. It lists names as roles, not as people. Legal liaison, procurement, compliance, external counsel, and next to each role, a task that reads like a blueprint for containment. Define inquiry boundaries. Prioritize release schedule. Identify privilege categories. Assess exposure revendor profiles. You notice what's missing the way you notice missing teeth in a smile. There is no task that says verify the allegations. There is no task that says follow the money trail. There is no task that says reconcile invoices to work performed. The memo doesn't look like an investigation designed to discover. It looks like an investigation designed to survive. I photograph the page, log its condition, and note the date twice. Because if you lose the date, you lose the pivot. You sit back, and the room feels smaller. The rain outside doesn't sound like ambience anymore. It sounds like pressure. This is the reversal that changes the meaning of everything you've touched so far. You've been treating the press release as a reaction, the FOIA delays as bureaucracy, the redacted pages as defensive caution. But if this memo is authentic, then the city wasn't reacting in October. It was preparing in June, which means the cleanup wasn't a response to a scandal. The cleanup was part of the system, a procedure that activates as soon as someone senses a dangerous document is about to become public. That's how a mature machine behaves. It doesn't wait for a fire. It assigns roles, drafts language, and chooses what counts as the story before the first spark reaches daylight. The system insight is procedural, and it's brutal in its quietness. Internal investigations can be built like theater without anyone ever calling them that. You pick a scope that's narrow enough to avoid the big questions and broad enough to sound responsible. You appoint reviewers who are technically independent, but operationally dependent, hired through existing council relationships, paid by the same budget office whose approvals are under scrutiny. You set a timeline for deliverables that aligns with news cycles, not truth cycles. You classify key memos as privileged, so the parts that explain intent can be withheld without admitting they exist. Then you publish a summary is not a lie. It's a funnel. It keeps the public's attention on the top layer, while the deeper layers stay in the dark. Still stamped, still filed, still unseen. You trace the memo's language back to what you've already collected. The phrases line up too well. Deliberative process. Non-responsive. The same phrasing you saw in the foyer cover letter. The same careful tone the press release used when it called the ledger inaccurate, without explaining which figures were wrong. The city didn't improvise its defense. It rehearsed it. And suddenly the missing meeting minutes from the emergency procurement briefing feel less like a clerical slip and more like a feature. If the meeting exists, but the minutes don't, the decision-making becomes unprovable without sworn testimony. And sworn testimony is expensive, slow, and rare. You flip the memo over. There's faint bleed-through, like the missing second page is still speaking through absence. A bullet point shows through in reverse. Half, legible, objective. Determine source and contain distribution. Source, contain, not determine validity, not correct, not reform, just contain. Now the case shifts under your feet. The black ledger page stops being the central mystery and becomes the trigger. It's the spark that activates a protocol. You picture the protocol in motion. A clerk stamps received, a supervisor routes to counsel, and counsel doesn't ask, is this true? Counsel asks, where can this travel? The shadow you've been chasing, ISNT, just a vendor network, or a split purchase order. It's an institutional reflex. Protect the boundary of what can be proven. In a real dossier, you can't claim motive without evidence, but you can describe the structure that makes motive unnecessary. When survival is the incentive, survival becomes the motive by default. You open your Fourier packet again and lay the memo on top, aligning dates like you're pinning insects. June 9, emergency authorization. June 10th, scope memo. June 12th, received stamp. Then weeks of silence and redact. Then, at last, the city's October narrative, delivered clean and calm. The timeline isn't a record of events. It's a record of control. You feel it in your jaw. The weird pressure of realizing the case isn't only about what happened. It's about who gets to define what happened means, and which documents are allowed to exist as proof. A cold case doesn't always die from lack of evidence. Sometimes it dies from evidence being processed into harmlessness. You don't have the missing second page. You don't have the author's name. You don't have the attachment list. So you do what you can do honestly. You treat this as a hinge, not a verdict. If the memo is genuine and properly dated, it suggests the investigation was designed early to control distribution and scope, not to discover truth. If the memo is genuine but misdated, it still reveals the kind of playbook the city uses when it feels threatened. If the memo is not genuine, then someone is trying to plant the idea that the response was pre-planned, which would be its own kind of weapon inside City Hall. Any way you turn it, the memo is a warning. This case is not only fought in meetings, it's fought in document life cycles. What gets stamped, what gets routed, what gets summarized, what gets redacted, what gets buried under procedure. And now you understand why your earlier questions kept slipping off the surface. You weren't only asking about numbers. You were trespassing into the machinery that decides which numbers are allowed to matter. You find the meeting the way you find a lie, not in what's said, but in what's missing. The evidence object lies on your desk like a confession that learned to whisper. It's a printed calendar invite, the kind pulled from an office system and flattened into paper so it can be edited with a click. The page is thin but stubborn, curled at the corners from being folded into someone's pocket. There's a greasy thumb smear across the middle where the ink looks slightly blurred, like the paper was handled in a hurry. Along the top edge, the perforation marks suggest it was torn from a larger printout, ripped fast and without ceremony. The subject line is plain, almost bored with itself. Briefing. No project name, no urgency, no reason for you to care. But the date sits there with quiet gravity, and it lands exactly where your timeline has been tightening its grip. June 11th, late afternoon. Location, Conf Room B. Duration, 23 minutes. 23 minutes. Not a round number. Not a proper meeting. A slice. Bend beneath the subject line. A list of attendees that reads like an anatomy chart of the machine you re-trying to understand. Procurement. Compliance. Accounts payable. A policy analyst. A legal liaison. A single senior admin whose title is vague enough to be harmless and powerful enough to decide what gets seen. No elected officials, no public notice, no posted agenda. Just the people who move paper and keep paper from becoming proof. You don't treat the invite as a smoking gun. An invite proves scheduling, not content. It proves proximity, not guilt. In a real dossier, you don't hallucinate crimes into calendars. But the invite does something else. It reveals the system's favorite place to make decisions. The space right before the official record begins. Because the city can tell you, truthfully, that the council vote was public. They can point to the posted agenda, the minutes, the video archive. They can say, look, sunlight. But what happens in the pre-briefing is where outcomes are shaped. It's where the questions are resolved before anyone asks them on camera. It's where a fix can be baked into procedure without ever needing a backroom. You file the request for the minutes of this meeting because minutes are supposed to be the fossil record of decision-making. They're supposed to show who said what was decided, what was deferred. What you get back is a letter that reads like polite teeth. No minutes exist. Not because they were lost. Not because the clerk forgot. Because the meeting was categorized as informational. Informational, that word that turns an engine into a brochure. Here's the system insight. And it's the kind that makes you feel tired even before the coffee cools. A bureaucracy can create meetings that create outcomes while producing no record of those outcomes, simply by labeling the meeting as non-deliberative. A briefing, a check-in, a touch base. The people in the room know exactly what decisions are being shaped. But the paper trail is designed to suggest nothing happened. Later, when the public asks why the procurement process looks strange, the system points to the official record, clean and complete, and says the rest was merely coordination. Coordination is where accountability goes to disappear. You stare at the calendar invite and notice the thing that feels like a fingerprint. Under attachments, there's a line item, summary _ v3.pdf, double quotes. But the attachment isn't included in the printout. The printout lists its name only, like a ghost on a guest list. And when you request that attachment, it returns to you wearing the same uniform as everything else, redacted. Not fully, not theatrically, enough to be useless. The title survives. The body is black bars. The dates are half-inked. The author line is gone. A summary without content is a joke, the system tells itself. You put the invite beside the June 10th scope memo and watch how the pieces align. June 10th, communications plan. June 11th, briefing. June 12th, received stamp. June 9th, emergency authorization. Your timeline isn't random anymore. It's engineered sequencing. And then the case turns personal in a way that doesn't require threats. Your phone rings once, late, and stops before you can answer. Not a message, not a voice, just proof someone can reach you. A minute later, an email arrives with no subject line, empty body, and a single attachment that fails to load. Broken link, a shrug, a reminder that the shadow doesn't always hide. Sometimes it leans close enough for you to feel its breath, then steps away so you can't prove it was there. You don't claim intimidation. You can't prove intent. There are innocent explanations, misstyles, spam, glitches, coincidence. But the timing wraps around your timeline like a tightening wire. You return to the invite and focus on what is still solid, the attendee list. A list is not evidence of wrongdoing, but it is a map of responsibility. These are the people positioned between the ledger and the public story. These are the people who can translate an explosive object into routine procedure. You choose one name, one title, and you do what the system never expects. You follow the paperwork outward rather than upward. You request conference room booking logs, because rooms keep records even when people don't. You request building access entries, because doors remember. You request email retention policies, because deletion is also a policy choice. You request the document retention schedule that defines what counts as a record. And you receive a response that tells you everything by telling you nothing. The booking logs exist, but they're considered internal operations. The door entries exist, but they're withheld for security. The retention schedule exists, but the section that defines informational meetings is missing from what you're given. Redacted again, in the exact place where the system defines its own loophole. It's not dramatic. It's worse than dramatic. It's consistent. Consistency is how systems confess without admitting anything. You look back at the ledger page and imagine it on someone else's desk, days earlier, before it reached you, before it was trapped inside legal categories. You imagine a hand sliding it under a stack, another hand stamping received, another hand routing it to counsel, another hand drafting a press release that sounds like sunlight. You imagine a 23-minute meeting where no one says bribe, where no one says fix, where no one says anything that would sound criminal if recorded. Instead, they say words like exposure, scope, narrative, and process. And while they speak, the money trail keeps moving, because that's the quiet cruelty of procedural corruption. It doesn't stop the city. It uses the city. It uses deadlines and emergencies and overtime to keep the machine too busy to question itself. Touch the printout again and feel the paper's slight warmth, as if it's still carrying the heat of the printer that produced it. It's such a small thing to stake a case on, but small things are what survive when the big things are scrubbed. I mark the invite with an evidence ID and note, in the plainest language possible, that the city acknowledges the meeting occurred while denying any record of what it produced. That's as far as you can go without making a claim you can't support. Still, the absence is loud enough to rattle your teeth. A meeting without minutes is a message. It says, decisions were made where the record can't reach. It says, you are chasing a story that was designed to leave you nothing but outlines. And it says, if you want the center of this case, you won't find it in speeches or summaries. You'll find it in the next layer down, where contracts mutate after approval, where change orders turn into quiet waterfalls, and where the same vendors keep reappearing in different clothing. Your lamp hums, the rain keeps time, and the shadow feels closer now, not because it's angry, but because you've started mapping its habits. You don't hear corruption at first. You hear paperwork breathing. The evidence object is a change order packet, thick enough to thud when you drop it onto the desk. It's bound with a rusted staple that bled a faint orange halo into the top left corner, like the paper bruised and never healed. The cover sheet is pale yellow, the kind of carbon copy stock that holds fingerprints and shame equally well. When you lift it, the pages underneath cling together with that humid tack of documents that have lived too long in a drawer. There's a smell to it, dust, cheap glue, and the faint, sour note of coffee that's soaked in and dried months ago. Along the right margin, someone has drawn a neat vertical line in pen, as if they were trying to fence the numbers in before they escaped. Across the top, a stamp hits hard in purple ink. Approved. The ink is smeared at the tail end, suggesting the stamp was lifted too fast. Somebody wanted this done. Somebody wanted it done now. You flip through the packet slowly, letting the lamp catch the texture of the pages. The work described is the kind of work that hides best in municipal language. Additional stabilization, unforeseen conditions, time extension due to site constraints. The phrases are soft. The velvet cloth you lay over a sharp object before you hand it to the public. And then you see the numbers. Not one number, a progression, a climb, a contract award amount that looks acceptable in the daylight. Then a series of small add-ons, each one not quite large enough to trigger an alarm on its own. They stack like poker chips. Change order 1, change order 2, change order 3. The packet tells you a story the council minutes never do. The real cost of a project is rarely decided at the vote. The vote is the doorway. The money often arrives later, through the side hall, wearing a different badge. This is where the system shows its quiet hands, because the public thinks procurement ends when a contract is awarded. The system knows that's when procurement becomes flexible. Here's the procedural trick, and it's so common it can live inside legitimate work without anyone blinking. You award a contract based on a defined scope. The vendor wins because their bid looks clean. Then the scope evolves. A pipe is discovered. Soil conditions change. A wall is worse than expected. A supplier delays. All plausible, all real sometimes. But the mechanism that turns reality into profit is the change order. A change order is supposed to be a controlled exception, documented, justified, approved. It is supposed to protect both the city and the vendor when the world dose and tea match the plan. In practice, it can become a second bidding process that happens without bidding. Because once a vendor is on site, they hold leverage. They have crews mobilized, equipment rented, timelines promised. Every delay becomes a threat. Every threat becomes a justification. And the city, faced with headlines about stalled work and angry constituents, starts to treat the vendor's price as the cost of peace. You lay the packet beside your earlier documents and build a new timeline from the signatures alone. Dates line up like footsteps. The first approval lands right after the briefing you can't get minutes for. The second lands after a legal review you can't read because it's redacted. The third lands right before a scheduled public meeting, just early enough that it can be referenced as already in motion. The work isn't merely changing, it's being timed. I note the approval dates and compare them to the posted agenda release schedule, because the calendar is a weapon when you know how to hold it. You reach the section titled Justification. It's a paragraph, maybe two, the kind that should explain the why, the urgent truth of a change. But here, the justification isn't missing in the innocent way. It's present, and it's blacked out, redacted, not the whole page. Just the sentences that would tell you who raised the issue, who verified it, and why the cost couldn't be anticipated earlier. The remaining visible words are connective tissue. Therefore, as a result, due to floating without bones, that's when your stomach tightens, because you recognize the pattern now. The system doesn't hide everything. It hides the connective parts, the joints, the places where intent would have to be named. You flip to the pricing table. Unit costs, hourly rates, material markups. These aren't hidden. These are shown with confidence. That's another tell. When something is defensible, it's displayed. When something is strategic, it's erased. You notice a line item repeated across to change orders, slightly renamed, slightly rearranged, like a face wearing different hair. One time, it's temporary access control. Another time, it's site security coordination. Same unit rate, same quantity structure, same rounding. It's not proof of fraud. Repetition can be real, but repetition is also how double payment is disguised as evolving need. You set your finger on the margin line somebody drew and realize what it is. It's a tally, a private attempt to see if the numbers are drifting beyond what anyone will admit out loud. This is the psychological cost of the truth. It arrives as arithmetic insomnia. You start seeing the case everywhere, in stamps, in margins, in the way a coffee stain spreads. You start hearing the city's calm voice behind every blank space, telling you nothing is wrong, while your hands keep turning pages that say otherwise. The packet contains a signature block. The names are mostly obscured, but the titles are still visible. Project Manager, Procurement Review, Legal, Finance. A ladder of sign-offs designed to distribute responsibility so evenly that no single rung feels the weight of the fall. That's the system's real genius, not bribery, dilution. If 10 people approve a thing, each can claim they approved only their piece. The project manager approved the need, procurement approved the form, legal approved the language, finance approved the funds. And when the public asks who allowed the cost to swell, the answer becomes a chorus. It went through process. Process is the city's lullaby. It puts accountability to sleep. You scan the last page, the one that makes you sit up straight. And not to exceed adjustment that increases the total cap quietly without changing the headline contract name. It doesn't look like a new award. It looks like maintenance, a tweak, a routine extension. But it changes the ceiling, and ceilings are where money hides, because the public hears the original number, not the expanded one. Your timeline now has a new spine. The case ISNT, only about how the contract was won. It's about how the real contract was built after it was won, piece by piece, under the cover of normal paperwork. You close the packet and listen to the rain until it sounds like applause for someone else. The shadow you re-chasing docent need to erase the ledger if it can inflate the truth elsewhere. It only needs to keep the public focused on the first number, while the real story grows in the margins, stamped and approved in quiet rooms. And now you know where the next escalation lives. If change orders are the river, there's always a hand upstream deciding how fast it flows. You're going to find that hand. You learn fast that the last signature is never just ink. It's permission. The evidence object is a single signature page pulled from the back of the change order packet, separated like a tooth from the jaw it belonged to. The paper is thicker than the rest, almost cardstock, with a faint sheen that catches the lamp in a narrow stripe. The top edge is torn in a clean, impatient rip. The lower right corner is dog-eared and darkened, as if it's been thumbed 100 times by people who needed it to mean done. A coffee stain blooms along the margin. Carol Brown dried into a brittle ring that smells faintly burnt when you hold it close. The ink in the signature blocks is smudged in one place, the blur of a hand lifting too fast, trying to outrun doubt. Near the bottom, there's a shallow indentation where someone pressed a pen hard enough to bruise paper, not because they were angry, but because they wanted the stroke to count. You don't see names. The names are masked, not fully erased, just obscured enough to keep the public from having an easy target. But the titles survive, and titles are where responsibility likes to hide when it's tired of being a person. Project Manager, Procurement Review, Legal, Finance, and then, last, in a box with more blank space around it than the others, Final Authorization. That box carries a different gravity. It's the last hand that lets the money move. It's the last check that turns a request into an obligation. It's the point where the city stops considering and starts paying. You stare at the final box until your eyes adjust to the small details. A faint stamp impression beneath the ink, like the paper was stamped once, then signed, then copied. The stamp doesn't show the words clearly, but the shape is familiar, bureaucratic, circular, official. The page looks like it has lived on a desk, where decisions are made quickly and defended slowly. I sleeve the page in a protective cover, because if this turns into a fight over authenticity, the first battle is always about whether you kept the evidence clean. You follow the signature block the way you follow a fingerprint through a crowded room, not by guessing who it belongs to, but by asking what it requires. To understand the final authorization, you have to understand the system that creates it. Delegation of authority. Cities run on delegated power. A council votes on broad awards. A city manager or chief administrative officer is granted signing authority within limits. Directors have limits too. So do deputies. So do acting appointments, which appear whenever someone is on leave, when a vacancy opens, when a role is temporarily reassigned for months. On paper, delegation is efficiency. A city can't stop for a vote on every invoice. It needs trusted signers. In practice, delegation is how a system can keep accountability moving while keeping it unclear. Because if the last signature is an acting signer, the public can be told, truthfully, that the permanent official didn't sign. If the signer is permanent, the public can be told, truthfully, that the signature followed all required reviews. Either way, the final box becomes a shield. It absorbs heat without revealing the decision-making that produced it. You request the delegation matrix, the document that lists who can sign what, at what thresholds, under which conditions. It's the skeleton key to the building's financial doors. The city provides it, part of it. The page you receive is clipped, and the section that explains emergency exceptions is missing. Not missing as in lost, missing as in absent on purpose. A clean rectangle of nothing where the rules for bending rules should be. The shadow doesn't always live in what's forbidden. It lives in what's undefined. You build a new timeline, not from contracts, not from press releases, but from sign-off windows. When does the final authorizer typically sign? What days? What hours? How close to public postings? A pattern emerges, and it isn't criminal by itself. It's worse than that. It's managerial. Binaural authorizations cluster around the moments when reversal is inconvenient, late in the week, after normal office hours, just before agenda packets post, just after a briefing with no minutes. This is how you make a decision feel inevitable. You don't prevent scrutiny, you outpace it. You take the signature page and compare the ink density in the final box to the others. The earlier boxes look rushed, checkbox approvals, quick initials. The final signature has weight. It drags slightly, like the signer paused mid-stroke. That pause is the part that keeps you up, because if someone paused, they noticed. If they noticed, they either asked questions or accepted the answers they were given. And the psychological cost of this work isn't fear of danger, It's fear of being wrong about what that pause means. You can't claim intent. You can't say the signer knew everything. You can't say the signer didn't. What you can do is trace how the system makes it easy for the signer not to know. Here's the mechanism, concrete and procedural. The final authorizer rarely sees the full story. They see a packet that has been filtered. Procurement confirms that required forms exist. Legal confirms that language is acceptable. Finance confirms that funds are available. Each reviewer signs off on their slice, and the final authorizer is handed a complete file. Complete doesn't mean true. It means reviewable. If the justification paragraphs are missing behind black bars in a FOIA release, they still exist internally, but the final authorizer may only see a summarized version. Unforeseen conditions. Recommended time-sensitive. And time-sensitive is the lever that moves everything. Time-sensitive is how urgency becomes a solvent that dissolves skepticism. In a healthy system, time-sensitive triggers independent verification, photos, engineer letters, third-party assessment. In an exhausted system, time-sensitive triggers a signature. You look again at the final box and notice a faint marking above it, almost invisible, like someone wrote in pencil and tried to erase. 2 letters, not a name, an internal routing code, the kind a department uses to indicate which unit pre-cleared the packet. A small mark that says this wasn't just one person signing. This was a pipeline. You feel your throat tighten, not from drama, but from the recognition that the case is no longer about whether the paperwork is strange. It's about whether the paperwork is designed to be strange in the same way, every time, so that no one ever has to take the full weight. You check your phone again. Nothing. No threats. No messages. Just that earlier sense of being observed without proof. The way a city can watch you without touching you, by knowing exactly which requests you filed and who has to answer them. You tell yourself, carefully, that paranoia is not evidence. But caution is part of survival when the record is this thin and the consequences are this real. You return to the signature page and hold it at an angle. The indentation of the pen stroke catches the light like a shallow scar. That scar is the only physical trace of a decision that could never be fully narrated in public. Your timeline now has a peak, and peaks are dangerous because they make people visible. In the next section, you will have to do the hardest thing. Synthesize without accusing. Name what the documents can support, and admit what still remains out of reach. Sitting in a file drawer behind policy, language, and polite smiles. You sit with the page until the lamp's hum becomes the loudest sound in the room. The shadow doesn't need to break in. It only needs you to blink. You don't get closure in cases like this. You get an organized wound. The evidence object for the final night is small enough to feel insulting. A sealed envelope, off-white and slightly yellowed, with a city mailroom stamp pressed into the flap so hard it left a shallow crater. The paper has that cheap, fibrous texture that catches on dry fingertips. It smells like dust and adhesive, like it sat in a drawer beside rubber bands until someone decided you were allowed to have it. The flap is still sealed, but the edges are wrinkled. as if the envelope was opened once, then resealed with careful pressure. The kind of pressure that says, "We touched this, but you won't be able to prove how." Across the front, in block letters, a label printed by a machine to clean for the contents. Final response enclosures, no sender name, no warmth, just procedure. You run your thumb along the seam and feel the grit of dried glue. Then you break it. The tear is soft but loud in your head. Inside, there's a single page, not a ledger, not minutes, not a confession, a summary. It's the city's final synthesis of itself. It states that the procurement process was reviewed. It states that no intentional wrongdoing was found. It states that procedural improvements are recommended. It lists a handful of reforms that sound good and mean little unless enforced. Training, documentation, updated checklists. It never uses the words you've been living with: money, trail, cold case, redacted, shadow, timeline. But your desk does. You lay the summary page down beside the torn black ledger sheet, the FOIA packet, the clerk intake log, the calendar invite, the change orders, and the signature page. The desk becomes a museum of partial truths, each one professionally shaped. Now you do the only honest thing left. You synthesize without pretending you have what you don't. Here's what the public record can support with the documents you've held under this lamp. 1. A ledger page labeled Black Ledger exists, physically, with a June date that predates the city's preferred narrative. You can say that because you have the paper, and because the received city clerk intake June 12th routing slip aligns with an intake log entry that also points to June. These are not theories. They are objects with dates. 2. The city's official story emphasizes October, frames the ledger as inaccurate, and leans on clerical error language while withholding detailed reconciliations that would prove which figures are wrong. You can say that because the press release is clean. The agenda summaries are column-starved, and the FOIA response repeatedly strips connective tissue with black bars. 3. An emergency work authorization dated June 9th exists, meaning procurement flexibility was invoked before the public could reasonably understand what was being purchased. Emergency authorizations can be legitimate, but the absence of an unredacted justification keeps the public from evaluating legitimacy. The justification memo's full blackout is a procedural fact, not an accusation. 4. A calendar invite shows a June 11th briefing with key internal roles and no meeting minutes produced, justified by a classification that treats outcome-shaping meetings as informational. That is how systems can generate decisions without generating records. And the retention policy excerpt you received fails to show the definition that would explain this loophole. 5. Change orders and not to exceed adjustments appear as the real pressure points, the place where a contract can expand after the public vote. This is structurally true even in honest projects. Here, it's sharpened by partially redacted justifications and repeated line items that appear under renamed descriptions, which at minimum demands scrutiny. 6. The final authorization signature exists as the last gate for money movement, and the delegation matrix provided is incomplete where exceptions would matter most. That missing exception section doesn't prove malice, but it does prove opacity at the exact hinge. where urgency becomes permission.
Like in Russia.
That's the spine you can build from paper alone. Now here's what remains in the dark. And you say it out loud because saying it out loud is the only antidote to procedural fog. You do not have the full Black Ledger book, only a page. Without the whole ledger, you can't confirm whether entries were selectively torn to frame a story. You do not have the unredacted justification memos, meaning you cannot verify whether emergency conditions were real, exaggerated, or invented. You can only state that the city has chosen to keep the reasoning hidden. You do not have the missing attachment summary _v3.pdf in readable form, and you do not have minutes from the 23-minute briefing. That means you cannot prove what was said or decided, only that a meeting occurred and the record is absent. You do not have ownership disclosure documents that conclusively link the 5 vendors beyond pattern indicators like shared addresses or agents. Those indicators can be suspicious, but suspicion is not proof. You can offer interpretations, not verdicts. And you do not have the internal emails that would connect intent across departments, because the FOIA response turns bodies into black rectangles, leaving you headers,
Like in
timestamps,
Russia.
and the lingering feeling of hands moving behind curtains. So what do you have? You have a case that behaves like a cold case even while it's warm, because the system treats it like something that must be cooled. You have a timeline that suggests preparation before public awareness. You have a money trail that appears to split, rejoin, and swell through mechanisms designed for flexibility. Emergency authorizations, fragmented vendor profiles, and change orders that expand the cap. And you have a shadow that isn't a person. It's the gap between what a citizen needs to know and what the system is trained to disclose. The city's final summary page wants you to accept procedural improvements as closure. It wants you to believe the problem is paperwork hygiene, not incentive design. But incentive design is the real story. When procurement staff are measured on speed, files get stamped. When legal teams are measured on reducing exposure, language becomes fog. When departments fear delays more than they fear misuse, urgency becomes a tool. When elected officials see only agenda summaries, they vote on silhouettes. When the public sees only totals, not line items, outrage has nowhere to land. A city hall fix doesn't always mean someone took a bag of cash. Sometimes it means the system learned how to make outcomes predictable by making records optional, by making accountability diffused, by making truth too expensive for most people to chase. You sit there, 2 a.m. stretched into morning, with the envelope torn open and the summary page laid out like a clean tablecloth over a messy meal. You could end this by declaring a villain. You could say a name you don't have, and let the story feel satisfying. You don't, because the most haunting aftertaste in this file isn't that one person might be guilty. It's that the system is built so nobody has to be. Nobody has to break a rule loudly. They can follow procedure quietly until procedure becomes the crime scene. You slide the Black Ledger page back into its plastic bag. You tap the FOIA packet into a neat stack. You fold the calendar invite once and place it beneath the change orders, like you tucking away something that shouldn't be forgotten. The rain outside slows. The city doesn't look different in the morning. It never does. That's how it survives. But you do look different, because once you've seen how a timeline can be managed, you can't unsee it. Once you've watched redacted ink land in the same places again and again, you stop believing black bars are neutral. Once you've followed a money trail far enough to feel it disappear into forms, you start understanding the real cost of bureaucracy. Not paperwork, but plausible deniability. You close the dossier, and the last thing you feel isn't triumph. It's the thin, metallic taste of knowing the truth is often public, but not available. The file stays open in your head because the system never truly resolves itself. It only reforms its language, updates its checklists, and keeps the shadow where it's always been, right behind the stamp.